Hi, fellow tea lovers. Settle in, because we've got a story. I'm Nell.
And I'm Rose. And today we're bringing you the tea.
Across era. Okay, before we start today, dude, like so much stuff has been going on, so I needed to ask you the following questions.
All right.
Have you seen that dude who drives around town with a gigantic rebel flag flying from his car?
I just encountered this in person for the first time this week. I feel like it was like on Manal or something.
It's always on Reddit.
I was like, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah. My old roommate was hanging out with her last week and she saw it for the first time. I'm like, oh yeah, because she lives across the river, so she doesn't see him as much.
That's like layers of weird here. Like, I mean, surface
beyond
weird.
Layers of weird.
Let's celebrate the losing team. Underneath the surface weird, New Mexico, not super involved. More underneath the surface weird. Like, do you really want to, like, just piss people off as a hobby? Like, is that, because that feels like the only motivation.
I know. Honestly, sometimes I'm surprised his car hasn't been messed with. It's not like a great car.
Yeah, I mean.
Like, it's like a few levels up from a hoopty. Do people still say hoopty?
No. It's like, it's not crap, it's crepe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, anyways, that was a weirdo. Okay, last thing before I jump in, I saw that Roberta Flack passed away yesterday. I know her, probably people my age would know her because the Fugees covered her song Killing Me Softly.
Oh, okay. I know.
Yeah.
It didn't click.
Yeah, I know. Sad. That's such a great song.
Oh, it is.
Oh my goodness. So let's move along. I'm going to tell you a story first, okay? Mm-hmm. The year, it's 1949.
All right.
Your husband returned from World War II in one piece. The two of you have saved up a bit of money on your husband's $2,000 a year salary, and you've decided it's time to take a road trip. A road trip in this time being a pretty accessible form of transportation for people. And so being able to take a road trip is like travel, adventure. It's something that not everybody got to do before this.
Right. The accessibility of cars really opened up the accessibility of movement. You know, you're not limited to public-based transportation.
Exactly.
Whole different landscape.
Yeah, so you pack up the car with your usual vacation supplies like clothes and a toothbrush. You get a book for your 8-year-old to read, and then you get a toy to entertain the 4-year-old. Gas at this time is about 27 cents a gallon, and you pack food to eat along the way because stopping at every Starbucks and Dairy Queen isn't really a thing yet.
Yeah, roadside, I think, grows up slower than road.
Yeah. But the most important thing for this trip is your guide. We're in a time without cell phones. There's no GPS. So your guidebook is going to be your all-encompassing reference for where you're going.
That was still true when I was a kid. The very first thing my parents would do when they were even considering a trip was Foders or Fromers.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So this guide was a little bit different. It contained lodging, restaurants, barbers, beauty shops, taverns, even like it advertised annual conventions, auto mechanics, churches, drugstores, nightclubs, service stations, and tourist attractions. There was no way you were going to hit the road without this guide. Most people had the guide, and you could find updated copies each year at your local Esso service station, which is now Exxon. And this was the Green Book. And this was titled specifically the Negro Motorist Green Book.
And this isn't something that I learned about until I was an adult, like thanks American education system for the 500th time. But it's not something I know a huge amount about. But like, yeah, I wasn't even aware that it existed until I was an adult.
Well, I learned about them very shortly ago. Again, thank you. Although my whole public education came from 3 states that are notoriously in the bottom 5. So it is what it is. But I learned about it when we were watching, remember during lockdown when you could have like a bubble? We were watching Lovecraft Country.
Yes. Excellent show. Highly recommend.
It is. Speaking of education, I don't think anyone said this directly, but it kind of feels like the education was like Martin Luther King, good. Malcolm X bad.
That was definitely the narrative when I was
right. Yeah, it definitely was. history books are written by the person with the most money. And I think it's a publishing house in Texas at the moment.
Actually, what a lot of people don't realize about U.S. textbooks is Texas pretty much does set the educational standard because most of the publishers of like elementary and high school textbooks are from Texas. So that's
when I was in school, I was always thrilled if my history book reached at least like a few pages on the 60s. We never made it to there. Like, I think every history class was always about, like, the founding fathers and the whatnots about that. Anywho, so I had learned recently that the Black Panther community was one of the organizations that started a food drive, kind of like community help, like we were talking about with the Mardi Gras things.
Yeah. Filling in the social gap.
Yeah. So I got to looking into this green book because I'm reading this book called Overground Railroad, The Green Book and the Roots of Black Travel in America. Is by a lady named Candace Taylor. And I also found, I think PBS had a video on their website of a short interview with her because the Green Book is currently on display in DC.
Really?
Yeah. So, the Green Book, let me tell you about it. Born in 1892, Victor Hugo, named for the writer, last name Green, was a postal worker and a bit of a travel writer who lived in Harlem. He first published what is now known as the Green Book in 1936. The book started the first year with places in and around New York City that would welcome Black people. At this time, a lot of things were still segregated. Separate but not equal. It helped you navigate that. And more so, there had been a campaign about don't spend your dollars where you can't eat, I think, or where you can't shop.
Wildly reasonable.
Right. So not only did it tell you like where you could be served, but it promoted Black businesses.
Yeah, it's as much an advertisement as a guide.
It definitely was. I found some copies online. The National Park Service has so much information. They have the best website. Probably going to jinx it by saying this. Like the national park workers, they are some cool people. Power to the national park employees.
The information, the collective institutional knowledge of those people is vast, and it cannot be underestimated.
It's such a good resource. Resources are on the website, by the way. But anyways, so it started with things in the New York City area, but it became so super popular that it expanded really quickly, and eventually it included the rest of what was officially and mediumly the USA, as well as parts of Canada, Mexico, Bermuda, and the Caribbean. So owning a car at this time, according to another author that I found, his name is George Schuler, owning a car was a way to be free of discomfort, discrimination, segregation, and insult. Public transportation, buses and railroads were segregated.
Publicly sponsored transportation is a minefield.
Right. You had, your non-white people train cars. They weren't as well kept as whites only train cars. So again, not equal. You can clearly see why owning a car, if you could do it at that time, and even at that reduced salary of a Black family of $2,000 a year, you could afford a car.
Yeah.
You could have freedom. However, owning cars as a Black person could be a problem. So because of this, there were a lot of gas stations, car servicing garages, restaurants. Not only if they had like a colored entrance, they might not serve you, period.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just like, oh no, honey, you can't eat here.
That's not going to be a kind experience.
No. But the problem with owning the vehicle was what they called driving while Black. So I'm going to read you this story out of the book I'm reading, Overground Railroad. I'm not going to read it word for word. I'm going to summarize it. This is the author's stepfather telling her the story. In the 1950s, his dad owned a 1953 Chevy sedan, quote, complete with all the modern features you read about in the magazines. And his family's driving down the road, and all of a sudden his father says, don't you dare say a word. And then he hears police sirens and they're being pulled over. And the sheriff says, like, where did you get this vehicle? And his father immediately just says, it's my employer's car. And he points at his wife and says, this is my employer's maid, and that's her son in the backseat, and I'm taking them home. And the sheriff is like, well, if you're like the chauffeur or the driver, I don't know what that was called, where's your hat? And he said, hanging up behind me on the back of the seat. And Ron, who was a little kid at that time, realized that that black cap had always been hanging on the back of the seat since he could remember. And that was very common. You would just say it was your employer's car. So you didn't come across as like uppity or trying to move beyond your station by being too prosperous. So you can see why this green book was very, very useful.
Yeah.
So even like as far back as 1917, W.E.B. Du Bois said that race discrimination had left him with, quote, a puzzling query as to what to do with vacations.
Yeah.
Right.
How are you supposed to exist at leisure when you're not even really allowed to exist in spaces?
A magazine writer in 1933 wrote that when you're in an automobile, it's mighty good to feel like the skipper for a change and pilot our craft whither and where we will. We feel like Vikings. So the Green Book, it not only kept travelers safe, but like we were just mentioning, it promoted Black business. In the 1949 edition, there was an ad for the fireproof new Edison Hotel in San Francisco. And their ad also promoted their coffee shop and cocktail lounge.
Oh my gosh, that's cool.
There were also special editions that came out in some years that focused on different modes of travel, like rail travel across the country, and then another on air travel, which was, quote, aimed to demystify international travel and make it more accessible for people. There were also sections about what to do in different cities. Big cities like Chicago could have several pages of text, and it always included nice photos. The what to do in Chicago section was 3 pages of text that included amusement parks, airports, museums, baseball fields, free concerts. So I looked down to see, of course, what New Mexico had, and there was quite a bit. And I found a listing of the things that Albuquerque had throughout the time, and all of them except 2 have been completely demolished. And then 2 others where it used to be the business, it hasn't been completely demolished, but it's like been incorporated into something else.
What are the 2 that still exist?
The buildings that still are standing are the De Anza Motor Lodge.
Really?
Yes.
Holy. What's funny is like I don't associate New Mexico with like road trips like would be described in the Green Book, because I think of it as an Eastern thing and like
Route
a Southern
66,
thing. But
baby.
Route 66. No, I know. I literally always forget that, even though I actually lived on Route 66 for a long time. We used to turn the couch towards the living room windows to watch the Twinkle Light Parade. Like we were on Central. It was the wildest time.
My backyard backs up to Route 66, but there is a business there and a tall wall, which is
helpful.
Oh, yep. Love my city so much. But the other one, the building that still exists was, I don't know what this is. It says Fred Harvey Airport Restaurant.
Oh, interesting. Because like the Yale area, that is one of the older parts of town, but not
all
oldest
of these places span from like the Arno Street ones. That's just right up off of Central by the Grove Cafe.
Right, because they have all those really beautiful Victorian houses in that neighborhood.
When you mentioned the Victorian houses, I was listening to a podcast recently, and it was one of those episodes where they read, whatever their listeners write in. And one lady was talking about her time in school, like I think getting a PhD or a master's at UNM, and living in a Victorian house. And I was like, what?
That was super possible, though, like not that long ago.
Well, she mentioned like she had rented it out, but I couldn't think of where any Victorian houses were. But she referenced they got to watch filming of Breaking Bad, and I was like, oh, right near the Grove. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's a really cool neighborhood. Terrible parking, but honestly, that's not their fault.
Parking.
We rented a house. Well, we rented an apartment in what used to be a tuberculosis hospital. So there were like doors that went nowhere and just as many built-in cabinets as you could possibly want.
Where was that?
And that was when we lived on Central on Route 66.
On the brick house?
The brick house, yeah.
Oh, dang.
Yeah, that was a convalescent home, and it was a steal of a deal for almost 10 years, and I cannot imagine what it's renting for now. But
who knows?
Yeah, no. It was also, it took them like 3 months in the winter to replace our water heater, so, it's give and take, but student rentals used to be a lot easier in this town.
Even when my daughter was getting her master's, her rental was like, it was in the student ghetto for sure.
Right.
But it was very reasonable and very nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the listings for Green Books, some of the most popular things were lodging, like I'd mentioned, restaurants, of course, but also something that dominated almost every single place were the beauty salons and the barber shops. But that was the community gathering spot.
Right.
So if you only had a listing for a barber shop, you could go there and they could tell you, oh, so-and-so, she's a widow. She rents rooms out.
Right. This restaurant is fantastic and you can sit where you like.
Also, it's so interesting because, we're in a time when women, period, didn't have bank accounts on their own. But a lot of these things, beauty shops and the lodging, were women businesses.
Right. Something that you actually could make your own money with, which is actually super thin on the ground.
Right. Because, in cities, there's definitely like hotels and whatnot.
Right.
But it's kind of like, renting your room like in a lodging house. Like it's old school Verbo.
If we, or
Airbnb.
Airbnb and Verbo as well, they feel like really new concepts. And it's really just circling back around to, if we were in a position to where we could cut off part of the house, this place would absolutely be a boarding house possibility.
Oh, that's why everyone was mad when you got it.
Yeah, everybody wanted to turn it into an Airbnb. It's my cottage, suck it.
All they would have to do is put in like a hot plate and a mini fridge in this room.
It would be perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is my art studio. It is my life. And we met the nicest realtor in the whole wide world is the only reason it isn't an Airbnb.
Yeah, that's true. So you could rent a room, you could, you could rent a couple rooms, you could stay in someone's house. And so, of course, you're advertising in the Green Book and everyone has the Green Book. A couple of notes about the Green Book. One of the taglines for the book, I think this was in the very back of the book I saw. There's a slogan that said, "Now we can travel without embarrassment."
I think embarrassment is defined differently than
way of what I would think. Yeah.
Right. Like embarrassment happens when you're trying to live a human life and someone walks up and says, "What, you thought you were human?" Like that's embarrassing, but that's not the kind of contextual embarrassment where you feel culpable for it. It's embarrassing for everyone involved that situation has ever come up.
Right. I was thinking about this. I'm like, what? Like, I'm trying to dumb it down, not because I think anyone's dumb, but yeah, just kind of explain it like I'm 5. Because like I am pasty white. And the most discrimination I can recall experiencing is like, it wasn't horrible. It honestly, is kind of amusing.
It's kind of like, I have been deported in my life. I have experienced
That's hilarious.
But it was the lightest touch, least effective on the rest of my life type of deportation you could possibly imagine.
Same with my experience.
Yeah, so I don't suffer under the illusion that I have had the same experience that people are having today.
Oh, yeah.
But I think I sympathize with it a lot because I've even brushed against that.
I was in the 8th grade. We lived in Hawaii. And so we lived in Honolulu and we lived like right smack on a very busy road, Salt Lake Boulevard. And at that time across the street was Navy housing. But it was a duplex. I think it was, the material used to make it was termites. It was incredibly small. In the early 90s, the rent was like $800 and it was, I think, 600 square feet. So anywho, my like dad's coworker's son had homes that he rented out, and my dad's coworker was like, yeah, like come over on Saturday and take a look. And we did. The only memory I have of it is that it was one of those houses where there's a room with no windows, and I think that's illegal.
Yes, I'm pretty sure you have
on a nice level.
Yeah.
But like I know that exists in places. I've seen the New York City apartment videos. We didn't get the house, and it was because the coworker's son was like, no, I'm not renting to white people. Which is illegal, but
that bites when it happens to anybody.
I think we were just kind of like, oh, well, that, If you live in Hawaii in middle school, you take Hawaiian monarchy for 2 years, or at least I did, and you just learn about how, okay, I'm reading a book called Black AF History, the Unwhitewashed History of America. And as he puts it, how like white people roll up, plant a flag, and they're like, this is mine now. Yeah. And that's what I learned in middle school.
Do you have a flag? No flag, no country. Can't have one.
Exactly.
No, and the fact that history is uncomfortable doesn't mean it didn't happen, doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and doesn't mean that it shouldn't be discussed.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're uncomfortable with the actions of someone in the past, well, don't replicate them. That's the only power you have over it.
Right. So this is the example I came up with, okay? I was like, what's an easy to understand example of just like flabbergasting style discrimination? I don't even feel like I need to, but I came up with it, so I'm going to share it. So let's pretend you're traveling again with your 2 kids, no husband this time. And you'd planned on stopping for gas in town A, but when you get there, all the gas stations are closed for the evening. And you can't make it more than 30 miles with the gas currently in your tank. The next town, 60 miles away, though. So you're like, ugh. But okay, it's fine. As you're coming to the end of town A, you see a roadside motel. And you're like, okay, the 3 of us, we're just going to have to stay there. So the motel has a sign. It says, vacancy, open 24/7. But when you step into the lobby, it goes like completely silent. And the clerk behind the counter is just like staring at you. And there's these 2 older dudes playing cards at a table in the lobby. And you're like thinking, this is the beginning of a horror movie. Mm-hmm. But you also don't have gas. So you're like, okay, hi, clerk. I'd like a room for the night. And it's totally not even your imagination at this point. Mm-hmm. You're like holding each of your kids' hands, but you can like feel the heaviness in the room. And staring you right in the eye, the clerk reaches to his side and presses a button. And you see the vacancy sign outside change. And he's turned on the no. And you're like, oh, a room for the night. Like, do you have vacancies? And he says, excuse me, we don't serve your kind here. And you're like, my kind? Like, is someone going to jump out and yell, gotcha? And you finally ask, you're like, what do you mean? And the clerk says, we don't serve people with kids. We hate kids. You need to leave. And you're like, are you serious? Even though you've noticed now that the card players are standing up. And the clerk slides a gun out from underneath the desk and doesn't blink. And he says, I'm going to count to 3. And that's my story. That's insane, right? That's so ridiculous, right?
And I think the only thing different there that I would add is that I think the element of surprise would not necessarily be there. Because I think in that era, like, like the second that heaviness was in the air, it was a problem. Not being allowed in a public space is a particular type of humiliation that should never be visited on anyone.
Right. And the way people now use the word embarrassing, I'm like, I don't find very many things embarrassing. Secondhand embarrassment is usually more my thing. Mm. But yeah, it's a totally different kind. And that's why the Green Book was important. Mm-hmm. You could drive into a town and it might not have a sign that you see right away that says like whites only, but that could be because everyone who lives in the town knows that. Right. We call those a sundown town.
You can't guarantee that people are going to identify themselves as an aggressor. You have to protect yourself in any way that's available, and this is real protection.
Yeah, and a sundown town was basically a town where, sometimes they would even pass their own laws to basically make discrimination legal. Even some towns had like a bell that would ring at 6 p.m. every evening. And that was the sign for like all the domestic workers and people who worked in town to get out. Mm. So when I lived in Alabama, I lived right outside of an area called Beat 14. And like, I don't know if other states are like this. Like areas bleed into one another rurally. Like you say, oh, I'm in Slap Out. Oh, I'm in Deatsville, Elmore, Beat 14, whatever. Yeah. And Beat 14 was a loud and proud sundown town for a long time, apparently.
And the fact that you were aware of it
I was super aware of it. Like one of the first things I remember hearing when I moved there, it didn't make sense at the time. I was like 14 when I moved there. Yeah. Was that like a singer who I can't remember had filmed a music video in that area, and it was a black singer. Mm-hmm. And at the time I was like, and then what happened?
Is that the end of the story? Mm-hmm.
It took me a while to catch on because even though in retrospect it was in my face, like I didn't know what the Confederate flag was. Like I didn't know what that was. Mm-hmm. I didn't know what it stood for. I had never thought anything about
I have opinions about
the South. My opinion was like, why do you guys act like it's like a capitalized the South? Like this is super weird. It did take me a little while to catch on to it. Yeah, it was like, that's like, hello, welcome to Small Town USA. Here's your intro, lore.
Mm-hmm. Right. Nobody hands you a guide.
Nobody does. In the 1947 edition of the Green Book, World War II had just recently ended, and there were a lot of Black veterans who were being denied entry into college. So the Green Book listed 106 Black schools and colleges listed out by state, and an article that was reprinted from the New York Times titled Money for Negro Colleges made the case for not just access to higher education for Black veterans, but also how to obtain financial support for the colleges.
Mm-hmm. And isn't it obscene, the circles that we live in, that, you know, you can't come to our school, you're the wrong color. Fine, I'll make my own. Your school's too good and I want to join it now. No, you didn't let me into yours. I don't have to reciprocate. You can't have a historically Black college. That's not fair.
Are you talking about the Super Bowl?
What? I don't know what you're talking about.
I love a drumline so much. I would have loved to have any musical talent whatsoever, because then I would have applied. I have zero sense of rhythm. So back to the Green Book and its author, Mr. Green. He was a postal worker, full-time job for 39 years. So even though his wife, Alma, wasn't listed as an editor and publisher until 1959, she contributed and eventually ran the whole operation. And in 1959, 4 of their 5 staff members listed in the title page were women. So it was an avenue for Black women to deny traditional roles. Mm-hmm. There were listings. Some of them were listed as tourist homes, and that took a second, but then that is the rooms. Like,
okay, just different.
Some places might have been a full-blown boarding house with people who lived there much longer, and some places were rooms you could rent for a night or 2 or 3.
No, that totally makes sense.
Yeah. That's a good way to make money if you have a spare bedroom.
Absolutely.
So tourist homes became a really popular way to earn income during the Great Depression. So that just naturally carried on as a way for women and other people to make money and giving them economic independence, which isn't that what we all want? Throughout its existence, the Green Book listed over 1,400 tourist homes. And in Nebraska and Michigan, except for Detroit, 90% of all the sites listed were tourist homes.
And how do you advertise that otherwise, except for like with a sign in the window and hope somebody drives by? Like, there's very minimal marketing opportunity there. So I mean, like, they're getting as much out of it as they're giving.
Definitely. And near the end of the book, there would be a list of, I'd say, slightly sarcastic safe driving rules. Mm-hmm. It included things like, quote, don't assume the other fellow has good brakes. Mm-hmm. And on a 3-lane highway, watch out for the driver who thinks the middle lane is his exclusively.
There will always be trouble.
Yeah. So once you had your Green Book, you could order copies by filling out the little order form and sending. They were free, but you sent 10 cents for postage. Or you could pick them up at your Esso store. The 1949 edition that I looked at the most, the introduction also has like a call to advertise your business in there and to get extra copies of the Green Book to give out to people.
Yeah, no, the more circulation you have, the more people want to advertise.
A lot of the information in the Green Book came from the Greens, obviously, but also from their readers and people who picked up the book and then would write to let them know, oh, well, I went to this place, you know, send them a Green Book. I left my Green Book with them. I need a new one. And the publisher would send out annual letters and postcards encouraging business owners to purchase ad space. The last issue of the Green Book was published in 1966. In the intro of the 1949 edition, the last paragraph says, quote, there will be a day sometime in the near future when this guide will not have to be published. That is when we as a race will have equal opportunities and privileges in the United States. It will be a great day for us to suspend this publication, for then we can go wherever we please and without embarrassment. This episode is going to come out. It's Friday. Hey, it's the future where you work.
It's Friday.
It's the future.
Oh my God, every time. I can't get that song out of my head.
But it's February 28th. It's the last day of the month, and it's the last day of Black History Month. But that doesn't mean anything. You should just keep learning, obviously.
Right. I think the biggest point for me, like beyond how supremely interesting the Green Book is,
I know,
story, is that we all got a lot of gaps left out of our education as kids. And part of it's because you can't teach the whole story of life and humanity, but a whole lot of it is that people just don't want to talk about it. We got to talk about it.
It wasn't until 5 years ago that I think you told me, or you made me realize that I thought I thought the U.S. like won the Revolutionary War. I didn't realize that England just kind of ran out of stuff and was like,
got
yeah,
a little
we're
worried
done.
about France.
Yeah. Thanks, France.
They were way more worried about France than they were about us.
Yeah. But I thought it was like, you know, a
Decisive
smackdown.
victory. The last general fell and our general put his foot up all Captain Morgan style and raised his saber and we was born. No.
Yeah, honestly, that's how it seems, right?
That's how they make it seem. And patriotism isn't wrong, but like excising half the story in the service of patriotism misses the point entirely.
I know. And I'm not saying that like you should just read history books, but like, I don't know, pick any topic that interests you. Watch Hell on Wheels and then learn about the Chinese contribution to America.
Now, I promise you, the stories of humanity are so much more interesting than the crap we make up.
They are. I had a really cool history professor, and one of the books we read was by a doctor who was in Hiroshima, and reading that book, it was kind of almost written like journal entries. Mm-hmm. Reading that book this is embarrassing. Oh, I just said I'm embarrassed in a different way. Like recognizing my own lack of knowledge, because it was one of the first books I'd read where it really clarified that like the us versus them mentality that war obviously has. Turns out that they're just people just like us, like literally just like us. You wake up in the morning and you go to work and you come home and make dinner. And I mean, I was in college when that happened. So I'm a big proponent of reading outside your school books.
Well, and I don't think that...
Also, you're probably not in school if you're listening to this. Let's be real.
Who knows if you are? Bravo. No, but I think the point is not to be embarrassed by something that you've never been presented with. And that's a really hard thing to get over. I think that's something a lot of us suffer from.
Anyway, so we hope you enjoyed our history lesson, and let us know what you think of our new mics and our sound quality.
We're seriously very open to notes. We're trying new things every day.
We're open to notes. And I have to confess, I haven't looked too hard into this, but I can't figure out how to read like any reviews whatsoever, which maybe is a good thing. But you could always leave us a message on our YouTube, because at least I know how to read those. And while you're at it, like and follow, and have a really good last day of February. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.